What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are going to use this rough cut black walnut to make a set of chairs. And other than a set of small chairs for a kid's craft table set, this is actually the first chair that I have ever made from scratch, and I've got to say I really enjoyed this build. So the material that I'm using is black walnut like I mentioned. What you see me cutting here are some 4x4 beams to cut everything down to size. So first you want to cross cut the back pieces and those front pieces to length. The back pieces were about 40 inches and those front pieces ended up being about 17 inches. And then I cut that back piece pretty well directly in half at a 3-degree angle. So when that piece is put back together how it was cut, it'll set straight up, but if you rotate the piece around, it sets back like this. So that's where that lean and the angle on the back of the chair will come from. So the material that I'm using had been planed on all 4 sides, but in that shot you can see that it wasn't exactly square. So I needed to square everything up before I could move on and make those cuts. So I ran 2 sides over on the joiner to get a nice angle on that first side, and then that right angle will go up against the fence on the table saw, and I'll be able to rip the excess off to give me a perfectly square board to work with. So what you'll see me here do as far as ripping this board is a little strange, and I'm not necessarily sure that I would recommend doing it this way. But because this board was a little too thick to make the full cut in one pass, I flipped it around and then I ripped a square out of that. So it's okay to do this. If you do this, just make sure that you have a push stick that supports the bottom board, otherwise you risk kickback. But this allowed me to get a perfectly square board on each side, and I ripped all 6 pieces of the chair frame like this to where they would match up perfectly. With the legs and the back cut out from that 4x4 piece earlier, it was time to grab my cross-cut sled and cut some pieces the same length. 2 of these 3 pieces will be the upper support frames of the back of the top of the chair, and 1 piece will be the support frame on the back of the bottom half of the chair. I also needed some aprons for the bottom of the chair as far as support, and the very bottom structural support which would tie the legs together. So I cut these pieces on my miter saw, the reason for that being 2 of those 3 pieces were cut at a 3-degree angle on each end, whereas the pieces that were cut with the cross-cut sled earlier didn't have an angle on each side. I then ripped those pieces that I cut with the miter saw in half because they would be a mirror image on each side, other than the front braces, which I'll cut to length a little bit later in the video. All the pieces of this chair will be assembled using domino tenons, so I needed to lay everything out first to get a look at where all of the domino tenons would go. Then I made a mark to line up using the domino, and then I cut the tenon out on each of these pieces. If you're interested in checking out the domino or any of the other tools that you see in this video, you can check down in the description where I have a direct link to each of the tools that I've used in this video. And if you're not familiar with the domino, basically it's a tool that cuts out a very precise mortise in whatever you're working on, and then you can use these tenons that are also sold by Festool to line everything up and connect the pieces together. The domino makes putting things together so easy and so efficient, and honestly it just makes building things a lot more fun and saves a lot of frustration and hassle. Which is a good thing, because with less frustration and hassle, that means there is a less risk that you will get mad and swear, which then means that less people will be able to see you get mad and swear and awkwardly stare at you like there's some kind of problem. Anyway, so what you saw me make there was the bottom side frame on each side. And you'll notice how I mentioned earlier that those support pieces were cut at an angle, which shifted the front of the chair out a little bit further than the back of the chair. So this will give the chair more of a staggered, angled appearance rather than just being a complete boxy square. Next, I cut the dominoes for the front top apron piece of the chair, and you'll notice that I'm taking everything apart and cutting the pieces one by one. This helps me prevent from getting all the pieces mixed up and keeping everything organized as I build this thing one piece at a time. So the bottom of the chair at this point is coming along nicely, and in order to keep this whole video from just being me cut out a bunch of random pieces with the domino, I skipped through that there, but you can see that I used 2 dominoes on that very back support piece to put that back piece in. Next, I wedged the bottom middle brace in place, allowing me to line everything up by making a mark for where that domino would cut, and then just how I've made all the other pieces, I use dominoes on the end to line these up and assemble them. One tip I have if you're using the domino to do this is to make sure that you dry fit everything before you get it glued up. If you cut something wrong and the tenon is in the wrong spot, after you have that glued up to get that apart, that is going to be difficult and you are going to have a mess on your hands. So make sure that everything is dry fit before you put those dominoes in permanently. For the upper part of the back of the chair, we're going to make this basically the same way we did on the lower part of the chair with dominoes, which should come as no surprise at this point. So those 2 pieces that I put in there came from the crosscut sled earlier, and here you can see that the chair is starting to take shape and actually begin to look like something that resembles a chair. So to make up the interior slats of the frame of the top of the back of the chair, we go back to the crosscut sled, cut a couple pieces that are the exact same length, and then one of those pieces will be ripped in half, where the other piece will be ripped in thirds. Those thicker pieces from the board that was ripped in half will go on the outside, and these thinner pieces, which are a third of that board, will make up the internal slat structure of the back frame. So I popped everything into place approximately where I thought it would look good, kind of eyeballed everything, and then I decided that I needed to measure everything to make sure it was in the right spot. Usually I try to eyeball things, and then when I'm done, they're crooked or they don't look all that good. So take your time, because a couple extra minutes is definitely worth it to keep everything nice and flat and flush, rather than the end result where something is kicked sideways because you were too lazy to measure it and you just thought you would eyeball it. So using these setup blocks to measure the internal slats goes right in along with just what I said, and these setup blocks are awesome for this exact purpose. I use these all the time, and they allow you to measure consistent distances in multiple places. So you can see there I had the block on the left side, slid it over to the right side, marked where each of those slat pieces would go, and then I just measured the exact middle distance for that middle slat, and everything lined up. It looked really good, and I'm really glad that I did this rather than try to guess on those. Here's an up close of what the back piece looked like, so you can see those slats are spaced out really well, and all that was left to do on the back piece was to put the main back beams on, which would be attached to the back lower beams of the chair, making this chair turn into a chair. So to make this 2-piece chair into a 1-piece chair, I'll give you a minute to guess how I'm going to do this. Just kidding, I'm going to use dominoes, of course. You probably should have been able to guess that at this point. And the cool thing about the domino is that it has a lot of different settings for different size tenons. So I'm using the biggest domino that they make. It's 140 millimeters by 14 millimeters. It's a tenon that's over 5 inches long. And this tenon on each side is primarily what will hold this whole chair together. Spoiler alert for the end of the video, these chairs ended up rock solid. I was a little bit worried that they might not be completely as strong as I was hoping for, but after I glued these in with a lot of pressure on there was no movement or give whatsoever, and this ended up working perfectly. Now I know I said I need to dry fit everything, but I'm gonna break my own rule here. The smaller dominoes, you can often pop them out after you've hammered them in, but those longer 140 millimeter dominoes, those are really difficult to get back out, so I just trusted myself that I made the cuts correctly. I double checked before I glued everything down, and they ended up fitting in place. So before assembling this thing permanently with glue, I took a roundover bit with my palm router and just softened up all the edges on the outside. Tried to do this while the chair was still assembled, but I found out that I just had to take everything apart. You really couldn't get to some of those corners and some of those edges with the chair assembled. So one thing you might notice is that I am taking the chair apart and putting it back together several times throughout the video. That's one downfall of the domino, I feel like, is that it does take a little bit of time to assemble everything, take it apart, reassemble it several times. But like I said earlier, you want to make sure that you have everything fit in place with that dry fit before you move on to the final glue up. So here are the bigger 140 millimeter dominoes. Like I said, these are the biggest dominoes that they make. And whenever you're doing a glue up, especially on something like this where there's multiple joints all over the place at different angles, you want to try to work quickly. You don't have to work so quickly that you mess something up, but you want to work fast enough to be able to get clamps on everything wherever you have the glue before that glue sets up and dries. So it's a good idea to kind of have some type of game plan and have all of your clamps ready to go before you get started, which should help the glue up process to go more smoothly. And you can see here that I have as many clamps on there as I can get, pretty much going in every single direction possible, which should hold pressure on all of those joints where the tenons are. I left the clamps on probably for 24 hours or so, and then I sanded all the surfaces down with 120. Sanding is about as boring to watch as it is to do, so we won't spend a whole lot of time and we'll jump right into how I made the seat for this chair. So if you remember those weird looking corner L-shaped piece things that we made earlier from whenever we squared the legs up, those are actually the pieces we'll be using to make the seat for this chair. So we need to go through the typical milling process on each of these pieces, that being joining one angle completely square, running them through the planer, and then ripping the opposite side of that jointed edge to width. After all of those smaller boards were cleaned up, we just clamped them together to take the little boards and make them into one giant panel, which will become the seat. I had originally planned on having the grain on the seats run perpendicular to the chair itself, which is why it's glued up at the angle that it is right now. And you'll see what I mean here in a second, but after I got a good look at this, how it looked on the chair, I didn't like it at all. And I really just felt like it looked like the seat was out of place. So here's the other panel after I had it trimmed up, and like I said, I just didn't like it at all. But if I turned it the other direction, I thought, hey, that doesn't look that bad. So I was able to salvage these top pieces even though I glued them up, originally wanting the angle to go the other way. So I grabbed my cross-cut sled and I flush cut everything square on each end that I previously cut at that angle. I then decided that it needed to be cut at an angle, of course, the other way, so I put the chair on upside down, marked an angle to create a slight taper on the seat, and then I used the crosscut sled to just line the line up that I had made at that angle, and I put a wedge in the back end of that to kind of keep that angle through a clamp on it, which turned my crosscut sled into pretty much the laziest taper jig that there's ever been. So when you think about everything that I just did on these steps, woodworking is kind of strange. I took a bunch of little boards, made them into a big board at an angle, cut the angle off to make it square, then I added an angle back. Or maybe woodworking isn't actually all that strange and I just really need to plan everything out better in my builds. So I cleaned the seat panel up by sanding it and then rounding over the edge with a router again. And then one last thing I needed to do was to glue in an extra brace on the support frame. And this is something that I should have originally done before I had everything glued up when I was cutting the dominoes out earlier. I honestly have no idea why I didn't put that center brace on there. So even without being able to put it in with a domino, since everything was glued up, I glued it wedged into place and it seemed to work out just fine. To attach the seat to the frame, I'm using Z-clips, so I grab my router with a slot cutting router bit, cut a couple slots on each piece of the frame, and then I put Z-clips in there, which will hold the seat down but also allow for wood movement over time. For the finish on this chair, I'm using Rubio Monocoat Pure. I don't have a whole lot to say about this. Finishing is kind of boring to watch, but you can see how good the Rubio looks. Rubio Monocoat is a super easy finish to work with, and I think the Pure oil looks absolutely incredible on walnut. A few days later, after the finish was dry, all that was left to do was to pop the Z-clips in place, and then screws can be used to attach the seat into those Z-clips, which will hold it securely to the frame. With the seat securely attached to the frame, that would finish this set of chairs up. So like I said, not too bad for the first set of chairs. I really enjoyed this. Working with black walnut was awesome. If you made it this far in the video, I hope you enjoyed this content. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and definitely stay tuned for more.